So, so today what I'm going to be talking to you guys about is I'm going to be discussing the poems The Gift in Wartime by Tran Mong Tu and the poem When You Go Away by W.S. Merwin. I'm going to be comparing the two works. Then I'm going to be discussing how they are representing postmodernism. I'm going to answer some objective questions for postmodernism. And I'm also going to talk about how the writers' lives affected their writing. So I'm going to be talking about those different topics as I go and just kind of showing how these works are the perfect examples of what postmodernism works should be like. So for the first poem, I'm going to be talking about both of them at the same time. I'm going to be discussing each of them as I go. So for how they compare, both of these poems, When You Go Away by W.S. Merwin and The Gift in Wartime by Tran Mong Tu, are discussing death. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the poem When You Go Away. So When You Go Away, it says, "When you go away, the wind clicks around to the north. The painters work all day, but at sundown the paint falls, showing the black walls. The clock goes back to striking the same hour that has no place in the years. And at night, wrapped in the bed of ashes, in one breath I wake. It is the time when the beards of the dead get their growth. I remember that I am falling, that I am the reason, and that my words are the garment of what I shall never be, like the tucked sleeve of a one-armed boy." So, from this poem, it is discussing the loss or the death of somebody. He's discussing how he feels when this person that he loves goes away from him, and he's discussing the haunting of his thoughts about how he feels about what it is like to not see this person anymore, and there's a lot of strong imagery in there. And for the second poem, The Gift in Wartime, it's very similar on the topic. It's discussing a woman and her love for this man who is now dead and gone because of the war. It says, "I offer you roses buried in your new grave. I offer you my wedding gown to cover your tomb still green with grass. You give me medals together with silver stars and the yellow pips on your badge, unused and still shining." And in the last stanza it says, "Seriously, I apologize to you. I promise to meet you in our next life. I will hold this shrapnel as a token by which we will recognize each other." So it's talking about, it says, "You give me your lips with no smile," and it talks about, "You give me the smell of blood from your war dress, your blood and your enemies, so that I may be moved." So it's talking about this death and this loss. So both of these poems have this common theme, this discussion and the feelings of what it's like to lose somebody that you love. Another thing that they talk about is war. You can clearly tell in each of them, especially The Gift in Wartime. She's discussing war. She says, "The blood of yours and my enemies." Your badges, she talks about the badges that he has and the shrapnel that she'll hold on to, the shrapnel from him and his injuries from the war. And when you go away, it can be talking about either one, most likely war, because that was something that was going on a lot in the time period of the postmodernism era. It talks about the one-armed sleeve of a boy, like in war people would come back without their limbs, and so he was actually comparing something like that, like an injury from the war, to his feeling of loss after this person is gone. Like, he's describing how it feels like he lost some part of himself. So that's another reason why his could be also talking about war. And The Gift in Wartime is talking about Vietnam War, and W.S. Merwin's When You Go Away could be talking about either war. It could be talking about Vietnam or World War II that happened recently before. So another thing is they both have this strong imagery. You can see what they're talking about. I know that When You Go Away is talking about, it says the painters have painted and the next day the paint's gone and there's nothing but black canvas. You know, you can see that in your mind. You can see what he's talking about, and you can visualize what this looks like. He talks about, "And at night, wrapped in the bed of ashes, in one breath I wake. It is the time when beards of the dead get their growth. And I remember that I am falling and that I am the reason." So, you know, you can see what's going on. You can see this, you know, this bed of ashes that he describes that he's in. You can feel this and, you know, you can visualize it. And the same thing with Gift in Wartime. You can see what she says, I offer you my wedding gown. You can see her laying this down on the grave. You give me the medals together with silver stars. And you can imagine her with these medals that she has left. It's all she has left of him. And you can almost visualize what she looks like as she's, at his grave and she's remembering him. So that's how they're both the same. They both have the same theme. Another thing is they both have the same style. They're both in free verse. And that's another similarity. Some differences that they have is when you go away, it ends dreamily. It doesn't really have a good resolve. The ending of the poem says, and that my words are the garment of what I shall never be, like the tucked sleeve of a one-armed boy. It doesn't have any resolve. It doesn't have any, last final word that says that this person is going to be all right in the end, that they're going to be able to recover from this loss. It doesn't have any resolve at all. And in the Gift in Wartime, it ends with this last stanza that says, seriously, I apologize to you. I promise to meet you in our next life, and I will hold this shrapnel as a token by which we will recognize each other. So she wraps up this poem by describing how she's going to meet him in heaven. So that gives it gives readers that resolve that they would like to have from a poem that's as disturbing as that one. So that's a difference, is that they end differently. When You Go Away is a lot shorter. It has a lot more metaphor and darker imagery in it than The Gift in Wartime, because The Gift in Wartime is a lot more organized too. So it's organized in stanzas. It has these little stanzas that she describes. She gives him this, but he gives her this. She gives him this, but he gives her this back. So the writer, who's a man, organizes it in this way. So then because it's talking about the gifts that they give to each other in exchange. She gives him this, but he gives her this back because he's dead. And the gift in When You Go Away is this dreamy, floating free verse. It's just describing the thoughts of this person. Everything floats into each other, which is disillusionment, which is, again, postmodernism trait that we've been looking out for as we've been going through this project. So we have that, and so those are the similarities and differences and how they compare in postmodernism. So what I'm going to be discussing next is how both of these works, When You Go Away and The Gift in Wartime, represent postmodernism. In my previous video about their differences and how they compare, I already kind of discussed what they have in common, and the things that they have in common are actually their postmodernism traits. To clarify that, I'm just going to recap what I said in the last videos. So a major thing that represents postmodernism is disillusionment. So both of these poems have a lot of disillusionment in them, especially When You Go Away. There's this dreamy state, this disillusionment is this confusion, it's very representative of thoughts, what's going in a person's mind, and there's a lot of this kind of thinking going on When You Go Away. The person is recovering from this loss. They're mourning this loss of this person. A line that is an example of the disillusionment in When You Go Away is there's this line. It says, "The clock goes back to striking the same hour that has no place in the years." So it's talking about this clock. No matter how much time passes, this person is stuck in this reality, this alternate, this place where there's no happiness. And that's another postmodernism trait, is this not having any happiness and this alternate reality. It says that sometimes, in the notes that we took, we discussed how sometimes the postmodernism stories or the postmodernism poems will have this characteristic of this alternate reality, this place, or this fictional area that the main character could be stuck in. And when you go away, the character's in this place. They're in that area of this not reality, they're not in the real world, they're in their mind, they're trapped inside themselves. So that's a disillusionment in that poem. When The Gift in Wartime has some disillusionment too, because again, it's talking about the thoughts of this woman and her mourning. So there's this, You give me your lips with no smile, you give me your arms without tenderness, and you give me your eyes with no sight in your motionless body. A lot of this poem is these lingering thoughts. It says, I offer you clouds that linger on my eyes on summer days. I offer you cold winters amid my springtime of life. So she gives off this kind of haunting feeling of this place where she's at too. She's in this place where she's in this reality. She's not in the real world. She's in her mind. She's thinking about what's going on in her loss. So again, the disillusionment is there, the whole alternate reality and confusion. Another thing is strong imagery. I already discussed that in the previous stories I talked about. When You Go Away has the imagery of that, the bed of ashes and the one-armed boy, and The Gift in Wartime talks about the imagery of the metals and, like I said, the clouds and springtime that she just discussed. I just read that to you a few moments ago. Another thing they have in common that is postmodernism is they both talk about the Vietnam War or war in general. The Gift in Wartime talks about Vietnam War, and her lover has died in this war. That's a postmodernism trait because that's what was happening at the time. This war was happening. When You Go Away is the same way. It talks about this loss. It could have been from war, or it could be from any kind of war, any kind of loss, but it talks about this battle, this inner battle that goes on, which is a postmodernism trait. So that is how these both represent postmodernism, and that's what I have for you on that. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is the objective questions. The main part of this project is to answer these objective questions of postmodernism. So I'm going to be answering the questions, and I'm also going to be linking them back to the stories as I go. So the first question is, how does religion fit into modernism? Neither of these poems that I have read to you have anything to do with religion. A lot of them are talking about other things. They're not discussing this religion, but it says that sometimes religion is the hero and sometimes it's the demon. It can be the hero, it can be the good thing, or it can be the bad thing, and it can weigh you down. And these were all things that we discussed in class together, which is what I'm reading off of. I'm reading, what we discussed in notes. So another question that we have is, how is figurative and form used? And I can actually link that back to the stories, because a lot of things that are used in postmodernism is symbolism, metaphors, imagery, disillusionment, all that stuff I just discussed in the past video. That stuff is how it's being used in postmodernism. There's a lot of imagery and being able to visualize what's going on in the stories. So another question is, how does nature get addressed? Both of these don't have any really thing to talk about nature. They have more to talk about, again, their inner, their psychological mind, what's going on with them in their minds. But it usually gets addressed with either destruction or some kind of unification. It unifies everybody. It brings things together. So nature can be the enemy, or it can be the saving grace, and that's how postmodernism addresses that. Another question is, how does human nature or psychology fit into postmodernism? So that actually links back to our stories too, because human nature, when you lose somebody, you're going to go into a mourning state. It's human nature. And another thing is you want that person back, which both of these poems are talking about. They want to see these people again, but they know that they're never going to. So they're in this state, this alternate reality of their own, of mourning. And that's human nature, to mourn like that and to want to be able to see somebody again after they've passed away. And a lot of postmodernism stories have to do with this psychology, or they're intense, and they have a lot of stuff to do with this psychological mind of human nature. So that's how human nature is represented in postmodernism. It's more of the psyche, what's going on in their minds. So another question is, how does postmodernism address government and society? Back in the postmodernism area, there was a lot of corruption in government, and society kind of had these expected social rules. But postmodernism's idea is that society feels like if the rule is not fair, that they should be able to break that rule. They should be able to go past it and to move on and to go to a better place where they want to be, to kind of live that American dream. So that's how postmodernism addresses the government and society. Society wants to break these rules, and government is not always doing what's right for everybody. So another question, another objective question is, what is the postmodernism American dream? And that's pretty easy because the American dream hasn't changed much over the years. The American dream is to be happy, to be able to go the places that you want to go, and to be able to strive to be the best that you can be and to do what you want. So to achieve happiness is the postmodernism American dream. Another question is, what are the characteristics of a postmodernist hero? So the heroes in our stories, the two poems that I read to you, are these mourning heroes. They're not, the heroes of postmodernism era are heroes that do good things, but they're not always for the right reasons. And we talked about the anti-hero, or the underdog that rises up, and the rage machine against society and government, or the bad force. So the characters in the poems that I've discussed, the When You Go Away and the Gift in Wartime, our heroes are not really in this category as a hero. They're more of just in this state, this mourning state. So they don't really relate much to that question. And the last question is, why did literature change throughout time? And the answer is simply because we change. We change as the years go by. We have new influences that come in from other places. We always are striving to become new things, to be better, to rise up, and to make what we are better, and to, represent ourselves as time goes on. So that is why literature has been changing throughout time, is because we as people have discovered new ideas, and we have discovered better ways to do things. So that is how, those are the objective questions, and those are the answers for them, and how they kind of relate to the poems that I've chosen. The next topic is how the writers' lives affected their writing styles. Both of my authors are from different places. One of them is an American, and another one is a person from Vietnam. Both of them were involved in American history. So I'm going to talk about Tran Mong Tu, which he is the author of The Gift in Wartime. I'm going to be talking about him first. So Tran Mong Tu was actually a journalist, and he worked with the Associated Press, which, if you don't know, that's a very large U.S. news service. I got all this information, by the way, from Glow & Co. literature book in the Before You Read sections for each story or poem. So in the 1960s, the U.S. became really involved in the Vietnam War, and so Tran Mong Tu experienced it firsthand because he was working over there in Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, with the Associated Press, kind of getting information the war to send back to America. So Tran Mong Tu, because he experienced this war, that really affected how he viewed everything about it, which the reason why he could put so many elements that were realistic into The Gift in Wartime was because he knew what had happened. He'd been there. He'd seen people die. In The Gift in Wartime, it discusses pretty much in detail about how the soldier's life had been, how the woman who had lost him had felt about him after he had passed away. It describes the shrapnel that had destroyed him and had killed him, and the blood that had covered him when he came back home to be buried. So Tran Mong Tu was able to put in those dark elements because he knew what had happened, and he'd experienced it because he'd become so involved in it. He was there in the capital of South Vietnam working as the Vietnam War was being fought, and that was at the time the most intense part of the war. When he was working, that was when America was really getting involved in this war. That was when everything was happening. So Tran Mong Tu's, this experience of his life was what influenced him to write this poem, and what helped him write these poems about the war. You can clearly identify how this event, being so involved in this war, reflected in his poetry. So that's just a little reason why Tran Mong Tu's life affected his writing. So our next writer was the writer of When You Go Away, and that is W.S. Merwin. W.S. Merwin was an American poet and writer, and he started out his career writing relaxed poems. He was very connected. He wrote poems a lot about nature and how that connected with everything. After there was a period in his life where he hit this block, where he was angry at society and he thought that society should be doing better at dealing with problems or social ills that had been going on. You know, there had been a lot of corruption going on in the government during this postmodernist era. There's a lot of poverty and poor, things that were just major economic and social issues that have been going on. And he became angry. He thought that we as Americans should be doing more to make these issues stop. So he hit this block and he started writing these angry poems. This was the time when the Vietnam War was starting to come on. And that affected him a lot, was this war, this Vietnam War. He wrote a lot of his major poems. One that I already did was The Asians Dying. He wrote that when the Vietnam War was getting ready. It was being fought or getting ready to be fought. It was a protest against it. He wrote this book called The Lice, which is these disturbing poems that are protesting against fighting and war and protesting against these social ills that need to be solved. So he was a very influential protester in his writing. That is how he became known. Well known was because he was protesting everything. So that is how his life was affected. Again, it was the Vietnam War that really affected his writing style and that change in his personality, where he felt like he really needed to step up and say something about society and say that it needed to be solved, that these issues needed to be stopped. So that was how Tran Mong Tu's life affected his writing and how W.S. Merwin's life affected his writing. In conclusion, in this presentation, I have discussed how The Gift in Wartime by Tran Mong Tu and When You Go Away by W.S. Merwin, I discussed how they compare, and I discussed how they are different. I also talked about how they represent postmodernism with their disillusionment, strong imagery, and their talk about the Vietnam War. And that is their theme. Their theme was to protest against the war and discuss this loss. So I also answered the objective questions, and for the ones that related back to my stories, I, talked about how they related back to the poems that I read. And then I talked about how the writer's life affected their writing. For the similarities, I talked about how they both had to do with death and losing somebody that you love, how they were both talking about Vietnam War and the intense pain of losing someone. I talked about their feeling, their imagery, and how they were both in free verse. For differences, I discussed how When You Go Away resolves itself differently than The Gift in Wartime. The Gift in Wartime has this resolve, but When You Go Away does not. I talked about the organizations. They're both in free verse, but one has these stanzas. The Gift in Wartime has stanzas rather than just floating free verse. I talked about how the postmodernists, how they represent postmodernism. And the objective questions I went over was, how does religion fit into postmodernism? I talked about how they did not talk about religion in my stories, but religion can be the hero or the demon. I talked about how figurative language and form is used. For the symbolism, metaphors, imagery, those are the things that, the forms and figurative languages that were used. I talked about how nature gets addressed, how it can be destruction or unification. I went over human nature in postmodernism and how both of these poems had to do with psychology, which was how human nature was addressed in postmodernism. Government and society, I talked about how there was a lot of corruption in government and how society had these expected social rules, but they felt like they could break them if they weren't fair. Talked about the American dream was to be happy in postmodernism era. And I talked about characteristics of the hero, which was doing good things but for the wrong reasons, and that anti-hero that some of the postmodernism works had. And then I talked about how literature changed throughout time, because we change over time. And then, so I discussed also how the writers' lives affected their writing, how Tran Mong Tu was involved in the Associated Press and was stationed in Saigon, which is the capital of North Vietnam, and how that affected his writing. And I talked about how W.S. Merwin had this blockage and change in his writing style to protesting against social ills and war. So, in conclusion, Tran Mong Tu's writing and W.S. Merwin's writing highly influenced the war and how people viewed it. It kind of gave people in the postmodernist era that feeling that they weren't alone in their grief. Lots of people were grieving over what had happened in the war. They were grieving for the loss of their loved ones. So many people had lost the people that they loved in the war. And I really think that these two poems really hit home on, why have we done this? Why have we put ourselves through this war? War only leads to this. All it leads is to loss and to death and to mourning. So these poems really were just kind of like a wrap-up, like, is this really what we want out of our lives, is to fight these wars and then have nothing but loss when we get back? Lots of people could relate to these stories. I believe that they wrote them so that they could contact their readers and say, you're not alone in this. We agree with you. We agree that what happened is wrong. We should not have fought this war. War only leads to death. And that is how I believe that these stories have helped society and helped better the time period and why they were written in the first place. So thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned a lot, and I hope that you learned about postmodernism and what I went over.